English translation 200th contact. Wednesday, 1st May 1985, 0311 hours.
So, my son, you told me recently that in the coming time, genetic research would be widely discussed, but also a renewed debate would break out regarding the concept of the incarnation. As this was already the case in earlier centuries, I mean in terms of the incarnation, and thus, the moment is meant in which the fetus becomes animated in the womb through the spirit form that is capable of rebirth, which includes the entire consciousness block of the new personality that is created by the spirit in the fetus, in which the spirit respectively enters.
That is of correctness. I have explained a few things to you in relation to this. The large and worldwide debate around genetic research will already soon have its beginning, but it will first be in a lot of humans' mouths at and around the turn of the millennium. Also, the question of the beginning of the incarnation will then be raised again in a strong form, and in this connection, all sorts of false suppositions and plain nonsense will dominate the agenda, especially through the pseudoscientific and pseudo-religious false assertions and ideologies of the know-it-alls, fanatics, politicians, parish staff, theologians, and, of course, through the sectarians, false prophets, media, and alleged contactees, as well as through the Pope, whose predecessors, being absolute amateurs in the matter of the beginning of the incarnation, already felt eager for hundreds of years to spread their nonsense. Thus, Pope Pius IX, among others, absurdly maintained and made the doctrine that Joseph's wife Mary, already from the moment of Emmanuel's conception, carried a rational soul in herself, and that already at conception the fertilized egg was animated by the soul, and so Emmanuel's personality and his reason had already existed. But the fact is that there is no soul because, in truth, this is identical with the psyche, which could have allowed the fertilized egg to become filled with reason, but that in truth it exclusively deals with the spirit form which is capable of rebirth, respectively, the spirit. Nothing of this was mentioned at all. But this could not have been otherwise, since this pope had no notion of the teaching of the spirit, aka creation energy teaching, and of the actual creational laws. Therefore, the inventor of the dogma of Mary's Immaculate Conception made an absurd assertion out of self-praise and arrogance, as well as out of unreal thinking, etc., namely, with regard to the fact that he would be absolutely immoderate and incorrect in that with the celebration of the Immaculate Conception of Mary. Something would be worshipped and celebrated that would be without reason, and with this the fertilized egg was meant. That's what happened in the year 1854. Years later, in 1869, he then changed the canon law in order to give validity to his nonsensical assertion. Yet up to that time, it was such that the fetus was inanimate up to 80 days after the conception, and the value of animation was only granted to it starting from the 80th day. In addition to various other things, this 80th day was also important for abortion, because after this time, one became punished with an excommunication. As a result of the absurd assertion of Pope Pius IX, from then on, an excommunication inevitably took place with each abortion, because the new rule was that through a sperm, the fertilized egg would already be animated in the body of the woman and, thus would be filled with reason and would respectively be an indivisible individual, as this term was adopted from the Greek word that is transliterated as etomon. But this acceptance of the individual and of being filled with reason are actually absurd, because, as you know, the animation of the fetus takes place via the spirit form on the 21st day after conception, with which also the heart begins its rhythmic activity, and thus begins the existence of the individual, because at the same moment, when the rebirth, respectively, The reincarnation of the spirit form takes place in the fetus. The new personality, along with the entire consciousness block, becomes born into new life. Furthermore, it must be said that prior to this moment, up to around the 14th day after conception, which can vary, still different processes in the fertilized egg take place, as for example, the division into twins.
You explain that just like a doctor.
Like Ptah, I have also learned this specialty. However, I have already explained this to you before.
Unfortunately, I forgot. But now, so that no confusion arises, if I should still take in later conversation reports and write this down, maybe it would be useful for understanding and such that once again, it is explained that the term individual is actually a transliteration of the Greek word etomon, as you have already said, and that this indivisible can also mean single being. In addition, it is also important to say that the origin of the term individual is actually connected with the term atom. But today, the designation individual stands for the single person, to which also scholasticism has contributed.
That is of correctness. As a result of scholasticism, the meaning of individual found a specification for the human personality, and then, in the 16th century, it developed into the special person. In today's German language, but also in other earthly languages, the term individual finds its meaning as a single person, as you rightly said.
You are also a German expert.
All of us who keep in touch with you have learned the German language very extensively.
Svath also spoke this language very well, but also my dialect.
That is well known to me.
He also instructed me in a good form in the German language. And with him, I also learned to write and to read, which was a reason for my first teacher. He was named Karl Graf, to take me, in a special measure, under his wing.
That is also known to me. Also that he was led to you by Sfa'ath, his telepathic impulses, and that he spoke about you with his friend, Carl Gustav Jung, whom you later became acquainted with in Zurich. When you visited your handicapped sister Verena in the Matilda Escher home, and you made yet another visit to the psychiatric hospital, Burghölzli, where C.G. Jung was visiting.
Explanation.
Teacher Karl Graf, with whom the little Edward Billy visited during the first 3 school years, was not only one of Eddie's great friends, but he also stood on friendly terms with priest Rudolf Emanuel Zimmermann and with the well-known psychologist and psychiatrist Professor Carl Gustav Jung. Karl Graf had been enlightened by the little Edward in reference to his contacts with the extraterrestrial Svath and, as proof, even once received the opportunity to be allowed to observe his aircraft with Svath's permission in Erachfeld in Bülach when Edward went to a contact. A contact with Svath was excluded, but the experience was enough for the teacher to promote, from then on, the scholastic progress of the boy entrusted to him, also partly in his spare time on a private basis. At the same time, it could not fail, of course, that Karl Graf was faced with many questions from Edward, which he also answered, faithful to his knowledge and understanding. If he could not do this, however, especially when it came to strictly psychological and life-related matters, then he contacted his friend, Professor Carl Gustav Jung, to whom he had reported of Edward, as well as of his sighting experience regarding Svath aircraft. The professor saw no reason in Karl Graf's remarks not to accept them as truth, as he also found no reason in them not to take a stand and not to let Edward's questions go unanswered. Interested in the boy, who asked such profound questions, he requested a photo from the teacher in order to be able to make himself a mental picture of Edward. Teacher Graf procured the photo and handed it over to the professor for examination, who made himself an exact mental image of little Edward. He also told his little niece, Lou Zinstag, of the young Edward, which was the real impetus for the fact that she became interested in extraterrestrials and their aircraft, and that she began to strive in the course of her life for all attainable photographic and written material, and became a world-renowned UFO researcher who did not let herself be easily deceived. In consequence of this, in the 60s, she got into a discussion with the British man Timothy Good, who told her of a Swiss by the name of Edward Meyer, who lived for some time in India and about whom the New Delhi newspaper, Statesman, reported as a contact man to extraterrestrials. Of course, Lou Zinstag tried to get in contact with Edward, who, in the meantime, in Persia, had become known as Billy by an American woman named Judy Reed, a name that would always remain with him, but she could not discover where he lived. But through a happy stroke of fate, it happened when she was staying with the American UFO expert and former Air Force Colonel Wendell Stevens, who already knew the Billy of whom she spoke, and he also gave her his whereabouts with the exact address information. Upon her return to Switzerland, she made an abrupt decision to make her way to Billy, with whom she then talked for a very long time, and she gained rock-solid insight that all details of the contact man, Billy, corresponded to the absolute truth, and that there was no deception or lie. An insight that she also represented until the end of her days. Still as a young lad, Billy got to know Professor Carl Gustav Jung personally. At the same time, the personal acquaintance came about through a happy stroke of fate, whereby the following happened. Together with his mother, Billy, at that time still Edward, visited his sister Verena in the Matilda Escher home in Zurich, who had been severely physically disabled since her birth and who had been staying there. From there, he set out on his short trip down to the psychiatric hospital, Burghölzli, where he still wanted to pick up an acquaintance who visited her sick father there. As Edward was waiting for the acquaintance in front of the main entrance, a man unexpectedly came to him and asked if he was, indeed, Edward, the former student of Karl Graf. He had seen a picture of him that the teacher had shown to him, and as far as he could tell, not much had changed. He was Professor Jung, the friend of the teacher, the one who had always answered the difficult and unusual questions for him. This resulted in an intensive conversation between the two, which lasted for 46 minutes, and it was finished when the acquaintance for whom Edward had waited stepped out of the main entrance. After the dismissal, Professor Jung and Edward went their ways and never met again. Excerpt insertion, Brockhaus Lexicon, Jung, Carl Gustav, Swiss. Psychologist and psychiatrist, born in Keswil, Canton Thurgau, 26.7. 1875, died in Küsnacht, Canton Zurich, 6.6. 1961, from 1910, professor in Zurich. Came from the psychoanalysis of S. Freud, but then developed his own teachings analytical psychology, of the psychological energy, of the individuation, of the individual and collective unconscious, of the archetype and the types of the consciousness attitude, introversion, extroversion. J also dealt with occult phenomena, and among other things worked on psychotherapy, religious and mythical research, ethnology, educational theory. Since 1948, the CQJ Institute has existed in Zurich, and since 1957, the International Association for Analytical Psychology. Works, Transformations and Symbols of the Libido, 1920. Extended, Symbols of Transformation, 1952. Psychological Types, 1921. The Relations Between the Ego and the Unconscious, 1928. Psychology and Religion, 1938. Essays on a Science of Mythology, 1941, From the Roots of Consciousness. 1954, Memories, Dreams, Reflections. 1962, Billy's Explanation. With the unconscious, C.G. Jung identified the subconscious. 30th of January 2004, Zerung 46 Hours, dictated by Ta.
Ah, that I did not know. Now I understand a few things better. I could have imagined that myself. That was probably also the reason why he so encouraged me in the German language and drilled me in such a wise as also Svath did.
That is of correctness. If it would not have been for Svath, then with certainty you would not have been able to read and write so well at the age of only 6 to 2 years. And if Teacher Graf also would not have assisted you, then you could not have already composed those written works, which you wrote in your youngest years. Those were amazing little works.
Thus, you know.
That is correct, because Svath was also one of my teachers, and of course he spoke with me regarding your person and task. He also presented your works to me, which he recorded constantly. And when I had studied these works, I decided to be assigned to your mission and the connection with you.
There, things come to light again. Interesting.
But it should remain there for today because you are not supposed to be burdened too much. I still have just a brief explanation to deliver. With regard to what was presented, in reference to the incarnation, respectively the animation of the fetus by the spirit form, as revealed from a future review, the absurd and erroneous claim that from the moment of conception, respectively from conception to human life, the fetus would be a reason-gifted life form and thus an individual will recently be reaffirmed, maintained, and taught again by an ignorant layman with respect to the rebirth of the spirit form and its animation of the fetus. This new irrational teaching is again generated and developed by a misguided religionist, namely by a certain Cardinal Lehman, who will express himself in this form on the 10th of June, 1991.
Thanks for the explanation. But Ptah said that distance is supposed to be taken from predictions.
That is correct, but that has nothing to do with the predictions hastily agreed upon by us. And now farewell, my friend.
You are suddenly in a hurry.
On the one hand, it is about your health, which is why I should not strain you too much, but on the other hand, I still have to settle the tasks that I am assigned to.
Of course I understand. Then until the next time. Goodbye.
So be it. Farewell.